Good evening, everyone. The September 26th, 2024 meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. May I please have a roll call?
Commissioner Funka,
Aye. Present.
Commissioner Lau,
Present?
Commissioner Patel,
Here.
Commissioner Sayason.
Here.
The record reflect Commissioner Gooding is absent.
Thank you. I may have asked for a motion to adopt the agenda.
I move to adopt the agenda.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That's 4 ayes. Motion passes with 4 ayes. Can move to the consent calendar. I'd like to ask if any members of the public would like to pull an item from the consent calendar. Oh, sorry.
There is nothing on the consent
Okay.
calendar this evening, I
Thank
don't
you.
believe.
Okay. Well, then we can move to oral communications. And we can like to ask the commission members if there are any items they wishes to address that aren't on tonight. Aren't on tonight's agenda.
No, thank you.
None.
There's no items present. Can ask if there are any oral comments from the and for that they can call in or by Zoom for the next 90 seconds, 60 seconds. Thank you. During that time, there weren't any written communications that I had seen that was received, correct? Thank you.
I think there was one regarding a planning commission training.
I'm sorry? Yes, thank you.
$15 seconds. All right, 60 seconds has elapsed. No one has raised their hand.
Thank you. We can move to, there is no old business, so we can move to new business, which are none, but we can then progress to the workshop presentation.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Chair and Commission. Get this presentation up. Okay, can everyone see that on their screens? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so purpose of tonight's workshop is to do a brief context setting of the density bonus and inclusionary housing legal kind of setting. Revisit the 2019 draft density bonus and inclusionary housing ordinance that was recommended by this commission. And then review and discuss some preliminary adjustments to the draft ordinance. So the planning context for density bonuses. There is a state mandated density bonus program that's been around since the 1970s. It allows projects throughout California with 5 or more units that include certain amounts of affordable housing to diverge from zoning requirements, including density, as the name might suggest, height limits, parking minimums, and other physical development standards. State law sets the floor for density increases, as well as the number of incentives and concessions, as they're called, that a city must provide. And cities can adopt their own kind of higher or more generous allowances, but they cannot go below what the state has adopted. So cities have to adopt ordinances that outline how they're going to implement state density bonus law. When it comes to inclusionary housing, this is a type of policy that's allowed at the state level, but not required. Cities can opt to adopt their own inclusionary housing programs. This is a policy that requires any housing development over a certain threshold to include a certain percent of affordable units. Cities are free generally to set their own inclusionary requirements. There are some parameters, however. There's a requirement for property owners to have a fair and reasonable rate of return. So meaning the inclusionary requirement isn't going to stifle or make development infeasible. Housing element law at the state level also requires that inclusionary requirements not constrain housing. So there's the kind of two-pronged approach at the same, getting to the same point there. There's also requirements at the state level that inclusionary requirements over 15% have to be accompanied by a feasibility study that shows explicitly there is no negative impact on housing production. And then we have our own regional policy that requires a feasibility study for inclusionary rates less than 15%. So we're free to set our own requirements, but there's a lot of kind of supplemental investigation that has to go in if you go over those.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I wasn't quite sure what the inclusionary rate refers to. What is that 15%? I guess I'm not sure what that's calculating.
It's calculated based on the number of units in a project. So if someone comes forward and wants to build a 20-unit project, and we had a 15% inclusionary requirement, 15% of those 20 units would have to be affordable at the rates called out in the ordinance.
But we don't really, I haven't seen 20 units buildings being built in Brisbane. So like if you have a
No, we sure have
3
not.
to 4 unit, sorry?
I said, no, we sure have not recently.
So if we have a 3 or 4 unit building, like what does this mean?
Well, so I'm talking here generally about policy at a high level. Our ordinance is a 6-unit threshold. So that said, we haven't had a project over 6 units since 2010.
Okay.
Yeah, in central Brisbane, we have not had many projects trigger this requirement. If you have anything you want to add.
But if, for example, just for total clarity, when I was reading through it a little bit earlier today, I think one of the limits was like 5. In that case, if one of them was, met these requirements, that would be 20%, and they would meet the threshold here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. And the other note I'll end with here is, inclusionary housing requirements are mandated on a project. Projects have to provide certain inclusionary units. Under state law, any inclusionary units are eligible for a density bonus request. So a city can't say, give us these units that are affordable, and by the way, we won't recognize those if you want a density bonus. If we're requiring them to be provided, developers can then request bonuses based on them if they meet all the requirements in density bonus law. So like we were just talking about, the city has had a ordinance implementing both the state density bonus law and our own inclusionary requirements since 2009. The ordinance hasn't been amended since 2009. Our inclusionary limit threshold is 6-unit projects. Density bonus law applies to 5-unit projects or more. So right now there's a little bit of a mismatch there. As I noted, we've had no inclusionary projects since 2010, and I'm only aware of one density bonus project, which was the senior housing development proposed on San Bruno Avenue, which entitlements expired and was not built. And that's a project where there was no density increase for a couple of reasons, but they did request incentives and concessions, and I think a waiver of development standards too.
So Julia, so for tonight, is that something that we can discuss then? I mean, are developers not building more than 5 units because they don't want this inclusionary housing requirement to apply to them, and should we consider reducing it to 5?
Well, one, the draft ordinance did reduce the threshold to 5
Oh, we
for
did.
inclusionary. Yes.
Okay.
Because at that time we were like, look, if someone's coming in with a density bonus project of 5 units or more and providing affordable housing, I mean, it just made sense when we were discussing it to make those thresholds the same. I think your other question is a lot harder for us to kind of speculate on, but I'm happy to engage in speculation if we want to kind of talk about.
Yeah, I don't
Development
think
in
that's
general.
really driving the issue in terms of that threshold. A lot of it's just sort of the lot sizes in central Brisbane in the R2 and R3 zones, or R3 zone in particular, where you might have projects. It takes a lot of some lot consolidation typically to get enough land area to exceed these thresholds. Is this another obstacle? I guess, potentially. In conversations, I've never had a developer particularly bring that up as an issue. I don't know if my staff has, but I wouldn't say that's a major consideration at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why it's been challenging to develop housing, at all in the Bay Area and certainly in central Brisbane. Like John said, small lot sizes, to some extent height limits. I think we've had some conversations with folks who are interested in doing a 6-unit project, for example, along Visitation, but it simply can't be accommodated with the height limits and parking requirements. So even though there's interest in doing larger projects that would then trigger that requirement, sometimes our physical development standards also kind of preclude that. If a project didn't want to take advantage of the density bonus law, that is. So yeah, I don't know if you have any other questions on that front.
But in that scenario, could they not apply for a variance if they wanted to exceed the height limit to accommodate more units?
So that's when a density bonus request would make sense. So if they were providing affordable housing, that then allowed them to, for example, exceed the height limit in order to accommodate the affordable housing that they're providing, and the additional density that they would be entitled to. That would be the vehicle I would see projects going through. A variance, is a very challenging planning entitlement to get, because you have to demonstrate there's some sort of unique circumstance that's special to your lot that prevents you from complying. And absent a density bonus request, we wouldn't really consider, a height variance to be justifiable in that situation.
Yeah, that would be unusual. You might recall too that the zoning cases you looked at earlier in the summer or in the spring or whenever that was with the SB 9, the companion rezoning case was to increase the height limit to 36 feet in the multifamily residential zones to at least get us to that 3-story threshold easily. May not still accommodate what a lot of developers need, but at least 3 stories makes some of these projects more viable, certainly, than a 2-story limit might be.
Thank you. That's all I have.
So, in 2019, the commission held several workshops and concluded with recommendations to council in April of that year to amend the inclusionary density bonus ordinance. So the highlights, like I mentioned, for the inclusionary policy, recommended reducing the unit threshold from 6 to 5 units, recommended a flat 15% requirement instead of what we use currently, which is like a sliding scale. That would be 15% for rental at 60% of the area median income, which is a very low income. And then for sale projects, for smaller projects, 15% at 120% AMI, which is considered above moderate income level. And then for projects of 11 or more units, 10% at 120% AMI or above moderate, and 5% at 80% AMI, which is the low income threshold. It also incorporated alternatives for rental projects to building units on site. So it allowed rental projects to opt to pay an in lieu fee at their own option without any sort of approval by the city. It also laid out a suite of all other alternatives that rental projects could request council approval for. I've listed them here, but so offsite construction, land dedication, funding a project elsewhere, and then other alternatives like acquisition of existing housing and conversion to deed-restricted affordable housing. So quite a menu, I would say, of other alternatives for rental. For sale, it actually eliminates the only kind of alternative, although in the current ordinance it's called an incentive. But basically, the 2009 ordinance allows for sale projects to meet inclusionary requirement by having ADUs, so accessory dwelling units that could then be rented. The 2019 ordinance, we opted to actually eliminate that provision. So as drafted, the 2019 ordinance doesn't allow any alternatives for sale. On the density bonus front, we really just cleaned it up to not duplicate what was in state law and really just talk about how we're going to comply with it. But of note, we did create, or the draft ordinance would create a small project density bonus. So for projects under 5 units, as well as additional concessions or incentives beyond what's required by state law for projects that go beyond the density bonus qualifications. So obviously it's been about 5 years since the draft ordinance was before the commission. The ordinance did not move forward to council for a variety of reasons that are discussed in the report, but essentially we had kind of an evolving regulatory environment at the state level. We had our housing element effort. The affordable housing strategic plan was also a huge effort that was really looking at how are we going to like fund and invest in affordable housing and anti-displacement. So all those kind of larger pieces caused staff to kind of hold the ordinance back. And at this time, we're ready to advance it forward. However, there's also changes that we're proposing for consideration tonight by the commission. So many of the changes are mandated by state law. I think they're pretty straightforward. They're summarized in the staff report. I won't focus on them tonight unless there's questions on them. So what we really wanted to discuss with you tonight was considering adding some more flexibility to the inclusionary requirements. So one of the key recommendations from last year's Affordable Housing Strategic Plan is an evaluation of the 2019 Inclusionary and Density Bonus Ordinance. That evaluation found that, recommended that we consider more flexibility to allow developers to use other means other than on-site construction to meet the inclusionary requirements. From staff's perspective, like I said, we do feel the rental provisions are pretty robust when it comes to giving a menu of alternatives, but for sale is pretty lacking or entirely lacking in terms of alternatives. So we can kind of put forward these ideas one by one, and I'll invite commission discussion after I introduce them. But the first alternative that we wanted to put forward was just reincorporating the 2009, the current ordinance requirements to allow for sale developments to meet their inclusionary requirement by providing ADUs. So I'll pause at this time and see if there's any commission reaction, thoughts, questions, discussion.
Juliet, remind me again, what would the in lieu fees go to again?
So in lieu fees, city would collect them. We would have a fund that would control their use to fund new affordable housing, or could include a variety of things. Basically, our affordable housing strategic plan laid out a bunch of different ways we could invest in like meeting affordable housing needs. It could be things like down payment assistance. It could be, new construction, acquisition of existing apartment buildings, and conversion to deed restricted units. So the use of the funds, they're not limitless. They have to be restricted to providing and promoting affordable housing. We can certainly talk about the other alternatives that are on the screen too. I realize I had stopped at the first bullet point, but happy to go on to the next one. Basically, other than the first bullet point, so reincorporating that 2009 provision we had proposed to eliminate. The second proposal is that we open up the menu of alternatives to for sale. So the menu of alternatives that we outlined in that ordinance for rental, allowing for sale developments to take advantage of them too.
Can you explain to us how the rental accessory dwelling units bullet point would work in practicality?
Yes, we did think about this. So there is a state law. Well, okay, I'll answer the question first. The way it would probably work is we would contract with some third party, either affordable housing provider or other consultant to manage the leasing of that unit. So obviously, in that situation where you have a single family house that's occupied by a homeowner with an ADU on the property that's must be rented to folks of a certain income, we have fair housing concerns. The homeowner can't really be in the driver's seat of leasing out the unit on their property. So that scenario is really what would have to occur. There'd have to be a firewall between the homeowner and the renter. There's a lot of kind of drawbacks to thinking about that. There is a state law that passed last year that allows cities to voluntarily adopt ordinances that would allow basically for ADUs to be sold separately from single family homes, basically creating like a condo situation. We don't have such an ordinance, obviously, but that is a possibility that if we wanted to kind of reintroduce that, it's possible that we could couple that with an ordinance that would also then allow for that unit to be individually sold and become basically a for sale unit. It would allow, the challenges of building for sale affordable housing. You have a lot of infrastructure costs, right? That like roads, driving or driveways, grading, like there's all these really big costs, and providing ADUs that possibly, I'm not saying we have to do this, but could also then be sold. I think it would achieve like kind of the same end result of a for sale product without it actually being a for sale product. It might be more viable for the developer to provide. So I'll kind of put that out there. I know that's a lot. I don't know if you guys are curious more. We can bring back more about that law also if you want to learn more about that.
So if someone built a 5-unit building and they wanted to meet the inclusionary requirement, they would then buy the right to build an ADU on a single family house. How would that work? Sorry, I'm confused.
It's
still.
really, that alternative really only works for detached single family.
Okay.
So our ordinance applies to subdivisions. So if someone bought a plot of land and it was large enough to accommodate, say, 6 lots, I guess, and it triggered the inclusionary requirement, they could, instead of having a lot that is developed with a house and then sold to a family of whatever income level we would require, they could potentially build 6 market rate units with an ADU on one of those lots that was, either restricted for rental to lower income families, or like I said, if we were going to consider that other ordinance, potentially allow that ADU to then be sold.
Sold at like a below market rate or
Yes.
something? Okay.
Yeah.
So then that 6th house would be buying it knowing that they would not actually have a whole lot. They would have a lot with,
That's right.
and they wouldn't have any idea. They wouldn't have any idea of who would be living in that lot because it would be like this sort of firewall you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's an option. I'm not sure if it's been exercised in many other places. I mean, we talked about this in 2019, a lot of the kind of challenges of that route, but it's something that, the developer would propose, right? And ultimately, if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't do it. But yeah, I think similarly, that's why we talked about this at that time, about eliminating it.
Yeah, obviously, if someone were to develop that, and that were a requirement, that would have to be disclosed to a buyer of that lot. Presumably, there'd be some market adjustment in terms of, what the market value of that property might be if you have a ADU that you can't control. So I think the market would maybe normalize that a little bit just by disclosure and choices of property owners and buyers and sellers.
Any other reactions on, so I'm not hearing a ton of enthusiastic
Well, okay, and
comments on the ADU one, but
for that unit, so that unit would not have any parking, correct?
that's right.
Okay.
So ADUs don't have to have parking.
Okay, thank you.
Again, this is just a workshop, so a lot of these ideas, if you're not, you want to mull them around and we want to come back and talk about them more, this is just kind of to tee it up for you to think about, and we can have more conversation at a subsequent meeting. There's no need to, reach decisions on some of these things tonight for sure.
All right, any other thoughts on the other alternatives? I mean, does that sound reasonable? I guess, yeah, I would like to know if the other alternatives that have been outlined in the ordinance for the rental projects, is there interest on the commission's side at this point to open that up for sale?
I just have questions.
Sure.
So I understand the in lieu fee, because I think we've talked about that before. How would a funding of offsite project by a nonprofit developer work? Would that be like in Brisbane, or would it be, okay?
Yeah. Yeah, so in that scenario, and that is, I should say, these alternatives are, I would say you will find most of them in the policies of other cities in the Bay Area. But yeah, so that example would be the developer of the market rate project basically finding a nonprofit partner and funding a project somewhere else in Brisbane that would, at least meet and maybe exceed the requirement.
And then for land dedication, that would be land that's dedicated to making inclusionary housing?
Yes, dedicated to a nonprofit housing developer.
Yeah, right now, I'm open to all the alternative suggestions that you've laid out here. I don't see any reason to oppose either.
Yeah, the ADU thing is a little weird for me, but I understand what you're saying.
I mean, look, the reality is, or in my opinion, the other alternatives that are outlined, way more viable for sale development.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are open to those, then frankly, I would probably withdraw the first bullet point suggestion because I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think most developers would go for any of the other options over that one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Feel like moving on? Okay. All right. The next category is looking at offering more incentives. So the first item we would put forward is considering an incentive to allow clustering of inclusionary units in separate buildings. So this is really more of a rental prototype, but it could be if there's for example, condo, could be for sale as well. But allowing clustering of units in separate buildings from the market rate. In a typical inclusionary project, you have one building with the market rate and inclusionary all mixed in. So this would kind of separate the income levels served. There would be certain standards that would accompany that. So for example, like maintaining a high level of design and connectivity between them, not really making it look like, oh, here's this beautiful market rate building and a substandard, right? So having really high design standards. And it would also open up again, kind of the same, thinking of like alternatives, like could potentially have a partnership again with a nonprofit developer who is, very familiar with managing, operating affordable housing versus market rate developers who may not necessarily have the expertise or frankly capacity to manage long-term affordable units within an otherwise market rate building. So I put that forward to you all. If you have any questions, thoughts on that, happy to talk about it.
Is there any experience with that, like, and evidence that that is an incentive somehow, that it makes it more likely that's worked here and like on the peninsula or other communities?
That's a really good question. I don't have any examples of that, but I think I could probably find some pretty easily and get back to you guys at another meeting. But yeah, I mean, that is, well, I'm not a developer, obviously, but from all the kind of study we've done of this, like that is definitely something that would be considered an incentive. It's, again, like I kind of mentioned, it can be tough for market rate developers to manage affordable units when it's, say, 10, 15 units in a larger building. From a city side, it's hard to monitor. I can't think of a specific example, but like, there would be a concern, I feel like, of just overall, like making sure those units are actually maintained as affordable housing. It's a lot easier to do that when they're in a building that's actually maintained by a nonprofit or, other kind of housing manager that specializes in affordable housing management and tenant selection and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with this. I think this would really incentivize developers. I mean, as long as what you said, the quality is still there, the design standards are still there, I think it would be easier for developers to sell the units and then to also maintain the rental units to a certain standard. So yeah, I agree with offering this incentive to them.
That's helpful. I think the other thing too that, to think about, or just to add on, is that, especially like, for example, in a condo development, we actually do have inclusionary units, for example, at 1 San Bruno. That was a project that provided inclusionary units with condos specifically of HOA fees. So even though the sales price may be a below market rate sales price, the households that are in that unit are, at a certain income level, there are other like kind of housing costs and controls that are really tough to control for lower income families. So I would just put that out there again. Seems like you guys are open to considering that, but that's another kind of equity issue that this might solve.
How does that work with multi-unit buildings if you're going to build an inclusionary unit with like an HOA fee?
Well, I'll just say at our, not to call it that specific property, but the property we have in town that has inclusionary units, to my knowledge, the inclusionary units pay the same HOA fees as all the others. This isn't something I'm super expert on, so it may be that as part of a project development, we could require HOA fees be at a lower ratio, for example. But then you also have things like insurance.
Yeah.
And is it really fair for, I mean, it may be perceived as not very equitable to allow certain homeowners to not pay their equal share of insurance that benefits all units equally, for example. So I think I'd like to get a little more information to dig deeper into that, but in the situation we have right now, there is no difference that I'm aware of in those fees for the other units.
Because it seems like then it was just like inclusionary for purchase price, but not
Basically,
really inclusionary after that.
Yeah, it can be a challenge. And like I said, I can look more into that. It's definitely something that we'd want to address if we ever did have like another for sale project that ended up incorporating inclusionary into the development.
Sometimes, I know we said there's not going to be a difference in design or quality or whatnot, but since it's a totally separate building, an argument could be made that the inclusionary units could come with a lower HOA. It's possible.
Right, that's what I'm saying. I think that's an advantage of having, you know, a separate structure is those fees could also be adjusted.
I mean,
Possibly.
could you mandate that I don't know if this is possible, can you mandate that HOAs be proportional to the sales price of the unit?
It may be. Yeah. I don't know. We can ask our legal counsel if that's possible. Okay. All right. Thank you. That is helpful. We can come back with more information on that. Okay. The second item we would put forward is to consider a fee waiver program. So that would certainly be an incentive, would be offering these developments that we're imposing these requirements on a break on fees. There's different ways we could do it. I've suggested one method of, you know, pegging it to the requirement itself. 15% inclusionary would correlate to a 15% fee reduction. This is obviously, you know, the city's fees are set and we would be taking a financial hit of some kind to be offering that kind of financial incentive. So if anyone has any kind of reactions or thoughts on that.
I have a question. I just have a question. So, you know, going back to your ADU question, your ADU scenario, if you have like 6 units and they're building 6 lots and they're building 6 4-bedroom, 3-bath houses on these 6 lots, right? And then you have an ADU and that's like a 2-bedroom, 1-bath. That's considered an inclusionary unit and it would be considered meeting the requirement. Let's say it's 5, sorry. Let's say it's 5 lots. And then you have 1. Would that be included, like, would that be meeting the requirement of the 15%? Because it seems as though it should be 15% of 4 times 5 bedrooms.
So
20
I think I know what you're talking about. So there's actually a way to do an inclusionary requirement where the percentage is actually square footage based.
Oh, okay.
I would say that's not super common in the peninsula. I don't know if any cities in the Bay Area do it, but that is I'm aware of policies in other states, for example, where it's, 15% of your square footage has to be dedicated to affordable housing. And that also allows a developer kind of more freedom to, how many units would that be? I mean, it's a square footage requirement, right?
Right.
So it could be any number of units.
Because I was just thinking, like, if you do a 15% fee reduction, you can have, like, 5 3-bedroom units in a studio, and it meets it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, but then you're getting a 15% discount on all the fees.
True. I mean, the fee waiver obviously could apply to just the affordable units. I mean, that's kind of what this is, that formula would do. But I hear what you're saying.
I think I'd like to know how financially that would impact the city before I consider that. I mean, it'd be nice if there's a way for the state to subsidize something like that. But, you know, if it's all on the city, you know, it'd be good to kind of know what our impact would be.
Kind of like model different, we could kind of model different size of projects and what the fees would be, a kind of gross estimate of what the fees would be, and then what potential fee reductions might look like. That's all. If you'd be interested, we could do that. I mean, to be honest, like if you guys were interested in exploring that, we would have to do that. I think a fee waiver program would be something we would really have to study in depth, and obviously be subject to council approval.
Would that be time consuming for you to do?
Possibly. We have a lot of housing support actually right now. So I would not shy away from investigating that a little bit more if it's something we want to
Let's
explore.
take kind of like a vote, like how many people are leaning towards supporting something like this?
The fee reduction
Yeah.
principle? I think so. I'm just wondering, I do wonder what how much the reduction would have to be to represent a true incentive. I don't know if you guys run like some of these incentives by developers, and they kind of reach a threshold and say, oh, all right, if you're going to make it, if you're going to do X, Y, Z and allow these incentives, I'll come in and do it. I'm still not totally clear. Like it seemed to me that you said at the beginning of the presentation that there have been no, under the old incentive structure, there have been no developments.
Not since 2010.
Not since 2010.
Yeah, which is the One San Bruno project.
So I wonder how much of this is just kind of purely hypothetical. How many lots and potential developments are there on the radar or that are feasible where these incentives might,
of
I mean,
5
you
or
could,
more
might be able to
units.
count them on fingers of one hand, maybe? Like you guys must have an idea of like, there's potential there. So that's one question I
Yeah.
had is, we're coming out with a lot of incentives here. What's the prospect that any of them are actually going to be used by a developer? And then I'm wondering, it's like a series of dials. And can you sort of market test them in a way, like what if it was a 30% fee reduction for 15% inclusionary? Would suddenly a bunch of developers jump on it? I just don't know that part. But in principle, to your point, yes, I'm in favor.
But
Of exploring it.
these sort of modifications to the statutes, they would apply to the Baylands or even like the quarry if they were going to develop that, right? Or even like Upper Brisbane, wherever. Would they apply to everywhere or just Central Brisbane?
Well, the Baylands will have its own specific plan in a development agreement. So whatever's in the city's ordinance, I would consider the floor for the Baylands.
Okay.
There may be a whole nother set of conversations and incentives and trade-offs because the scale of development out there is so different than what you deal with sort of, in town proper.
Okay.
So I think we really have to look at all of this as being aimed at the infill in town, because the Baylands will be a whole separate conversation about what is the right mix of units and incentives to get, and what is the rate of affordability we can achieve out there.
And that's allowable, right? You can have different requirements for different parts of a city for.
Especially with the development agreement and a specific plan, yes, for sure.
Yeah, so then I go, and then I agree with you. How many projects are, I mean, how much land do we really have that's undeveloped that could possibly?
Meet the limit, right?
I would say when it comes to undeveloped land, not a lot. But when it comes to like consolidating lots, that's possible. But I can think of, I don't know, maybe 3 sites that could actually, that are zoned for at least like 6 or more units that are vacant, for example. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, we have, not recently, but prior to the pandemic, we had a couple examples on San Bruno Ave of single-family dwellings being demolished and developed at a higher intensity. That said, it was like a single-family home being developed into like a triplex or a fourplex. So, there's opportunity for redeveloping developed sites and acquiring developed sites. But yeah, is that super likely? We don't necessarily see a trend of that.
Yeah, and the state, the way they change things around, it's a little different market, because you think of like SB9 subdivisions, right? You do an SB9 subdivision, it's very simple and straightforward, and it may be only 2 lots you're getting, and maybe you could theoretically get a higher yield by some of these other tools and devices, but is it worth somebody's while? But then again, those aren't really aimed at developers, and Brisbane hasn't been a real target in the infill areas for developers. I'm really interested in consolidating parcels and doing a development in Brisbane. At least that's not been the nature here. I mean, people look on the ridge and not the ridge, the acres, and they'll see large undeveloped parcels and think, well, maybe I could do something. There's some regulations, given the environmental constraints and other constraints, that sometimes send those people away for other reasons other than any of this affordability of housing. So I until things change, whether it's, areas of town redevelop like Crocker, or where then those would become the kind of sites that could be redeveloped in this, not under current general plan, but are those kind of the future sort of scale of housing in Brisbane that might be the more Parkside? Yeah, those might be the next gen.
And
we're
that's
doing
what we
is-
should have in mind a little bit when we're discussing this, like there might not be opportunity in the existing base.
Yeah, I think we're take the best shot of what we have, obviously, when the market, and if the market gets to that point, then I think it'll be time to revisit what you started with here. But you need to have a foundation. And I think we want to have a foundation that's, one, is consistent with state law. We could cover, the kind of nominal or minimal development we'll have in the future, and creates a good basis for, future adjustment down the road based on market conditions and where Brisbane's redevelopment is headed.
Yeah.
So what did we agree on? Are we gonna let staff look at the financial impact to the city if we do this, fee reduction, or?
I mean, I think at this point, we can get more like information on what fee waiver programs look like in other cities. As we always do, borrow from our friends. So we can get a really good idea of what kind of options are already out there, what other cities have maybe learned from and dealt with and maybe fine-tuned to address. And then, I think we can do some kind of gross level modeling of, typical development of X size would, have this amount of fees, and then this would be the fee impact of different kind of waivers. So I think that's really viable for us to do.
Yeah, I think so, because honestly, when I see fee waivers, I don't even know what it means in the context of, because you have fees for service that the city, connection fees. We don't have a lot of traditional impact fees, which is really, I think, what these are primarily aimed at. If you had a park fee that said every unit had to pay $2,000 a unit to build a park fee for that cost, those get really easy to figure out. So I'm not sure how far we can even get down the road, because we don't have,
We have
honestly, any
we have a
existing.
public art fee,
That would be the only one, yeah.
and then we do have for subdivisions. So not
Well, the Quimby,
multifamily,
but
but the
that's-
Quimby, yeah.
That's kind of a state law. I don't know how far we can even go with that. But anyway, I think as you see, we even internally don't necessarily. So I think
Maybe
the idea
easier
of-
said than done or something, or than calculated.
Well,
It
it might
doesn't
be
seem
things
like-
like connection fees I would put out there, like water service connection fees, sewer connection fees. There are, I think, some fees but yes, good point, Director Swicky. We should play out what the actual fees are that could possibly even be waived or reduced. So we can do that too.
Can you, sorry, I don't want to make more work, but can we also look at statutes that do it by square footage versus by number of units and how they do that?
Oh, like the inclusionary requirement?
Right,
Sure.
thank you.
Yeah.
I just think it's kind of,
It's interesting to think about.
yeah. Because it's like you build a studio for one person versus a 3-bedroom for a family. It's like a different kind of inclusionary requirement.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
that would require,
That'd be,
that would be a whole, I mean, we can do this sort of back of the envelope, but for the city to do that, that is not how the state of California does inclusionary. And as Julia pointed out, anything that gets us away from that 15% count
oh, that's true. We
is
would
going
have to do a
to trigger a
feasibility study.
whole sort of fee economic
Yeah.
study that I don't
Good
know
point.
that at the end of the day, we'd have the appetite to undertake. But I mean, I think the idea of back of the envelope, we're glad to sort of pursue it for you.
Yeah.
Which ones do you think might have the biggest potential impact? Maybe the in lieu fees or something like that? If there's not that many sites that could actually
Yes.
accommodate developments that are big enough to meet it, maybe that's what it would be, because it could apply to another.
I mean, I am kind of speculating, but I feel like, well, one in lieu fees are kind of the most common, at least that we've seen, alternative in general. And yeah, I would say they're exercised probably the most.
Okay.
Maybe related to the fact that they're most commonly offered. But, collecting funds, I mean, that's a double-edged sword. You have to use them once you have them, right? but you can use them to achieve potentially like deeper levels of affordability, potentially provide more units. Because, you know, if we're funding, for example, a project by a nonprofit developer who can also leverage other funding at the state level or federal level, tax credits, et cetera, stack all that funding, you might get more units by, you know, having funding that you can contribute to a 100% affordable project than you otherwise would with them being built in the developments. So, all right. Okay. Well, like John said, this was really just kind of higher level overview of some of the things we're looking at, investigating, and exploring. So next steps would be more workshops if needed. I think based on tonight, I would definitely say us having at least one more workshop to bring you back that information you asked for and kind of play out some of these scenarios in more detail. And then we're looking at council draft ordinance coming to you guys before the end of the year, schedule allowing, and council hearings in 2025. Are there any other kind of questions, comments, discussion before we close?
Just one question, that lot next to the Brisbane hardware store, that large lot, would that be considered large enough, you know, to build a multi?
Well, I don't know, the one right next to the hardware store is actually a city-owned site, the one with the kind of foundation remains. So the one that's a parking lot.
Yeah, the one's a parking
Yeah.
lot.
So that is one of the properties that was previously entitled for a senior housing development. I think 16 units.
Oh, 16 units.
And it was combined with another property, right? So yeah, it's both, yeah,
We did like a design thing with
we
that, right?
did. Yeah,
that
there was a
gonna
design
happen?
permit. No.
Oh.
Yeah, the entitlements expired, I think in 2022.
Again, an issue when you have non-developers get entitlements. They get entitlements and then you realize that the market won't build what they've got entitled. So not a marketable project at the price point, for sure.
But there's very few lots within the city that are that size that are vacant, right? I mean, there's not that, I don't. see
That are
many.
truly vacant, like in the core of central Brisbane.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
anywhere,
scattered
really.
sites, but yeah, that's probably one of the larger ones in downtown. Do you think of any? Oh yeah, Southwest Bayshore. So along Bayshore Boulevard, there's a pretty big, I forget the exact size, but there's vacant property there as well. Challenging to develop on Bayshore given the slope and access. And the property that the Housing Authority sold also in 2020, that's zoned for single family. Planner Robbins,
Conversation for another day.
yeah, reminded me there are some other vacant properties in town that are
But
zoned
they are not
PD.
zoned residential at the moment.
So yeah, no, you're right. There are very few vacant parcels like we talked about, but I think from a redevelopment standpoint, like, I mean, John mentioned Parkside. Thank you for reminding us about that. We have adopted overlay zoning along Park Lane as well as Park Place to allow for development, redevelopment when it's economically viable. You know, obviously we haven't had any takers on that yet. I think because, you know, we have we're all leased up in Crocker, and we have a pretty low land basis as a landlord, and you've got tenants. You know, not a ton of incentive to totally change your land use. But it's there, and they're big sites.
Yeah, everything will cycle through. I mean, before Prologis bought a lot of those properties, the previous owner was very interested in converting industrial to residential. The community, I don't think, was there with housing at that point in time, so that cycle came and went. And hopefully there'll be another one in everybody's time here and have that opportunity again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
staff items.
And is your mic on?
Yes, are there any items, staff items?
Just a few. One is a reminder, Day in the Park is the 5th of October. We'll be down in the park with a planning community development booth. So if any commissioners want to come down and join us or throw food at us or whatever, you feel free to do that. There's a planning commission workshop training you got a flyer on for the end of the month. It's that countywide training. Last meeting, the council did approve the contract to start the planning program for 70 Old County, which is the old B of A site. So probably something will roll out in the fall, later in the fall about that. And then just kind of give you a heads up that we expect the environmental impact report for the quarry project to be published in October. So you'll have some reading material. We expect upon publication of that document and likely to have a public hearing on the draft EIR later in the fall as well. So.
Great, thank you. Any items from the commissioners?
No, thank you.
Great, thank you. Otherwise, then we can adjourn the meeting to our next regular meeting, which will be October 10th. And there will be a meeting likely, oh, possibly, October 10th, 2024.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much.
Yeah, can bring it next time. Can you decide if you want to have some preliminary draft language?